Rebecca Armstrong is a sustainable tourism specialist at the Travel Foundation in Bristol. She moved by the train to Bolzano. That's a great experience. Well, nothing to add. She left her career as a lawyer to pursue a new path in sustainable tourism and holds a master in responsible tourism management. And she will talk about 5 milestones to future-proof tourism right before we go a little bit later to our light lunch. But this is a really, really important speech and should be a good basis then also for the afternoon's discussions. Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this important event and to share some insights with you from our work at the Travel Foundation. So just work out the slide. Great. If you don't already know the Travel Foundation, we're an NGO. We're based, as Harold said, in Bristol in the UK, but we work globally with a variety of destinations and industry partners. We see ourselves really as a critical friend of the industry, both to encourage and to challenge, and to ask those hard questions along the way to help support the transformation of the industry to a low-carbon future in which the significant benefits that tourism can bring are really harnessed and shared both with local communities and to benefit the environment, so that tourism can truly deliver on its potential as a force for good or as an agent for positive change. I really like that phrase. I think that, that's exactly what we want to achieve. In terms of hard questions, the topic of climate change, tourism and how we respond is certainly one of those hard questions, but I believe there's also a future of opportunities if we're brave, bold and collaborative. So briefly looking at the interrelationship between tourism and climate, 2023 was the hottest year globally since records began. By June 2024, the 1.5 degree threshold of global warming had been broken for 15 months in a row, several years earlier than predicted. However, climate change isn't only a crisis of coping with increasing temperatures. Its impacts are also inextricably linked with natural disasters, extreme weather events, the loss and destruction of biodiversity, financial and health crises, conflict, food and water insecurity, and the mass migration of people. Bringing it back to tourism, as you'll be aware, tourism not only contributes to climate change, as we heard earlier, but also is impacted by it. Travel and tourism create an estimated 8 to 12% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, and that contributes in turn to global and destination level impacts. It has the potential to diminish the tourism product itself and to affect customer satisfaction and confidence. So how is the tourism industry stepping up to this significant challenge? The Travel Foundation, alongside a number of partners, was instrumental in the creation of the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Action in Tourism at COP26 back in 2021. The declaration brings together signatories from around the world across the global tourism industry. We now have just over 900 signatories and still growing around this collective commitment to halve emissions by 2030 and to reach net zero as soon as possible and by 2050 at the latest. But what does that actually look like? Can we envision that future? We set out to answer that question in the research report you can see on the screen, Envisioning Tourism in 2030, that we published last year in collaboration with a number of partners and sponsors. Paul Peters and Bernadette Popp of the European Tourism Futures Institute were the principal authors. And the report was really designed to help policymakers and the tourism industry really envision what a global, thriving, decarbonising tourism industry could look like by 2030 and through to 2050. So looking firstly at the future, if business as usual just continued, the research underscored that essentially tourism is growing without really considering that emissions are growing at the same time. So this diagram models the future of business as usual, showing that in that scenario, emissions are set to rise steeply rather than fall. By 2050, under the business as usual model, tourism-related emissions would increase by 73% from 2019 levels. And between now and the end of this century, if business as usual continued again, travel and tourism would use 66% of the world's remaining climate budget. So in other words, we'd only have 34% of the global climate budget to do everything else other than travel. Obviously, that's unthinkable. So our report used a systems modelling approach It applied 40 different interventions around 7 categories, and they could be dialed up or dialed down. And our goal when we started out was to come up with a few different paths to net zero, to kind of dial up and down those interventions and look at potential different paths. But in the end, we only found one single plausible decarbonisation scenario that would enable the tourism sector to grow as expected and to maintain its significant contribution to social and economic development, but while still complying with that net zero target. That was essentially by throwing everything we could at the problem, but also slowing down the growth of air travel, so keeping total distances flown, close to 2019 levels. We almost got to net zero by 2050. We didn't quite hit the 50% reduction target by 2030. We get there in about spring 2036. So that just shows the urgency, really, and how much we're paying for not having acted sooner as an industry. I'm pleased to say there is some good news. The single scenario that we identified does show that people can keep travelling. Tourism can still flourish in a net zero world by 2050. In the model, the number of trips, the total revenue, the number of overnight stays would match what we'd see if everything kept going as usual. The key difference is that the total difference people travel would only grow at about half the pace compared to business as usual, and the shape of how we travel looks different, which I'll look at. So where could this take us? The good news, as I say, is we can continue to travel, we can continue to fly, we can continue to see the world without killing it. In fact, in terms of distance travelled, around 90% of trips from the business as usual scenario are unchanged. And the model also means opportunities. So it means genuinely sustainable growth, where travel and tourism thrive by growing without polluting, enabling us to continue exploring the world responsibly. It also means new opportunities, the creation of new products, markets, places and solutions that really enhance the travel experience. It also means quality over quantity, so we prioritise discovering closer destinations, we take longer vacations, we have meaningful journeys, as we heard earlier, over frequent short trips. And frequent flying is no longer a badge of honour in this scenario. In fact, flying is more expensive, but there are accessible, affordable alternatives such as high-speed trains. More flexible working practices would mean we could go away for longer, and therefore we can travel more slowly, enjoying the journey and the experience. Multi-stop and multimodal travel becomes seamless, enjoyable. I experienced that over the last couple of days. Just 4 trains to get here from my home in the UK to Bolstering, and even luxurious, facilitated by digital innovation and new partnerships. And then in terms of return on investment, just 2 to 3% of overall travel and tourism revenue would be expected to yield significant returns, benefiting investors while preserving the environment. That all sounds great, but how do we get there? So being blunt, if we're to have any prospect of reaching net zero by 2050, which is just over 25 years or about a generation away, we can only grow the areas of tourism that are most ready to decarbonise. In turn, that obviously means stopping growing those areas that are hardest to decarbonise. And so we come to the elephant in the room, because we can't talk seriously about decarbonising tourism unless we're prepared to tackle the issues around aviation. So in 2019, flying accounted for 55% of all tourism-related emissions, but only 23% of trips. Long-haul flights are particularly polluting. Aviation, as you'll know, is also really tough to decarbonise. So unlike other transportation modes and accommodation, which can lean on electrification and renewable energy, so we saw that great example of Hotel Icon earlier on, but we're still a long way off having that for aviation. We're still a long way off having large fleets of electric planes, especially for long-haul flights. Sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, is still in its infancy. In 2019, it made up just 0.1% of the 300 million tonnes of jet fuel used in commercial aviation. Delta Airlines has commented that there's not currently enough SAF available to power its planes for even one day. So scaling up SAF from this tiny amount is challenging. Biofuels have their own issues, such as limited land use, equity considerations around that too, a shortage of organic waste. So our model leans on synthetic e-fuels. Offsetting isn't a great solution either, if we're honest. It's complicated, and there's also a risk that it might just distract from investing in long-term emission reduction strategies. It might also be fair to say that to a certain extent the elephant is kind of outside the room rather than in it. Despite flying being an essential component for many tourism products and destinations, as a tourism sector we have little influence over route development or airline investments in new technologies. It also raises equity issues around whether developing economies should be able to build new airports, for example, and how to support those destinations that rely on aviation for connectivity. So our message from the Travel Foundation really this year is it's time to get real. We recognise that growth in global tourism is pretty much inevitable, but the same can't happen for emissions. So it's time to get real about what green growth really means. It is possible. Our scenario proves that. But let's not fool ourselves into thinking we're winning just because we're making some progress with green growth while overall emissions keep climbing. So certainly cutting down on emissions intensity, the emissions per trip, customer, unit of GDP is really important. There's also talk about decoupling emissions from growth, meaning that emissions grow more slowly than the economy. But being real about that, the problem is that any progress we make can be wiped out by the sheer number of additional trips if growth just continues unchecked. Total emissions are going up every year when they need to be going down. And at the end of the day, the planet doesn't care about emissions intensity, it cares about total emissions. So if your business or destination can't grow tourism without also growing emissions, it's time to seriously rethink whether growth should be the goal. So I want to touch just briefly on the connection between climate change and heritage, both cultural and natural. That connection is long and deep. The ancient civilization of Angkor Wat in Cambodia is believed to have collapsed because of the impacts of climate change. And closer to home here, as you'll be far more aware than I am, the increasingly rapid glacial retreat in the Alps is well documented. And obviously this has an impact on visitation and tourist activities. In Europe, this graphic from research by the European Commission is really an illustration of the reason for this coolcation trend that we heard about earlier. It's showing how global warming at different degree levels, so 1.5, 2, 3 and 4, will reshuffle Europe's tourism demand, particularly in coastal areas and across seasons. There's a clear north-south pattern, as we heard earlier, and a change in visitor preferences. So that really underscores the need not only to decarbonise, but also to adapt what we offer in terms of the tourism product. Thinking about climate change's impacts, they're not experienced equally everywhere. As this quote shows, they're unequally distributed across systems, regions and sectors. And climate change impacts are also disproportionately felt by those who travel the least and cause the least emissions. They've got two stats, both based around 1% here. 1% of the world's population causes more than half of the greenhouse gas emissions from aviation. In contrast, low-income countries, predominantly in the global south, account for less than 1% of total travel and tourism emissions, but will suffer the most from climate change. And in the case of small island nations, they're often economically dependent on tourism as well. So this map shows the tourism destinations that are most at risk. As you can see, the division is striking between the north and south. So coming on to the 5 milestones I promised, I'd like to consider 5 things that are achievable, practical and impactful. I'll go through each in turn with some examples to illustrate them. So the first milestone is global emissions accounting. So this means bringing international transport emissions within national and business carbon budgets. Even seasoned professionals in the travel industry are often surprised to learn that international emissions from flights and crews are excluded from the Paris Agreement's processes. They fall outside its decarbonisation regulations. So these emissions from aviation and cruise are essentially ghost emissions. There's a need for regulation to cap and reduce these emissions, and even businesses are advocating for this. They recognise the importance of creating the right incentives for decarbonisation and ensuring a level playing field. There are various approaches that could be considered here. One option is to include these ghost emissions in the national carbon budgets of destination countries rather than source markets. This would give several additional benefits, such as fair allocation of that extra carbon budget. The destinations would have autonomy to decide how to use that carbon budget, including whether to allocate it to tourism at all. This would encourage them to attract the types of tourism and markets that offer the maximum benefits with minimal CO2 emissions. So tourism has to take leadership and responsibility for all of its emissions, and with international travel, such a significant part of this, not accounting for aviation's emissions in tourism's targets and actions surely starts to look like greenwash. It's also important to question whether it's sensible to grow long haul further or even continue to rely heavily on long haul markets. It's the most polluting, it's least likely to become green in the coming decades. It undermines resilience with regulation and also prices set to soar, so the cost of sustainable aviation fuel will be higher, frequent flyer levies, etc. It's also increasingly unpalatable from an equity perspective. As I said earlier, our model doesn't advocate for stopping flying altogether, but the shape of flying, and particularly trying to reduce the growth of long haul, is key to that. Thinking about value as well, just a thought on why we need some caution with the idea of value. I think if we focus too narrowly on the idea of value, that can be problematic. There's sometimes a conflation with high-spending individuals. We need to consider the whole picture, including costs, so we need to look at net value. And value is subjective, and it comes from more than just spending. So while visitor impact analysis is important, we're recommending focusing on quality tourism rather than just quality tourists. As we heard earlier from one of the speakers, Michael, I think, said that it's not just about demographics, it's about the types of tourism that will attract the right kind of visitors that will deliver the value that we're looking for. So not all spending is equal. We need to optimise the value per tonne of CO2 and factor in costs to understand the true value. Not all spending is equal. We should ask perhaps what best supports local businesses, for example, what supports local jobs, what helps us build resilience to future shocks, what's well distributed seasonally and geographically across the destination. Just wanted to highlight this recent paper in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism, which really highlights two key tools in a DMO's possession, optimising the marketing mix for low emission groups and setting a growth threshold. And just want to highlight a couple of destinations that are starting to do that. So we've been working to support climate action in Finland recently. The National Climate Action Plan there for tourism includes managing a labelling system, offering subsidies for sustainable enterprises and focusing on these low carbon markets. Similarly, in Norway, part of Norway's 2030 strategy includes creating an optimal market analytical tool. So they use this to devise new target groups based on those markets that have the lowest climate costs. So they use their national tourist survey to derive consumption figures, and they then use those to target actions and target those specific markets that will help them achieve their goal, which is a 10% per year decrease in tourism-related carbon emissions. So, for example, when they analysed the carbon intensity of the Norway tourism sector, that revealed that business travel was the most carbon-intensive segment, 2 times higher than both domestic and international leisure tourism. So looking at target markets in a different way from a carbon perspective and in terms of what best value is generated for the CO2 delivered is a key strategy there. So my next milestone is that we need to start identifying and providing low and net zero emission tourism options at scale. These could include road trips, packaged itineraries, tailor-made trips, new cross-border train journeys and more. I think there are huge opportunities here. We should be seeing more and more of these coming to the market within this decade. And where will yours come from? We're working with a number of tour operators at the moment who are considering this. And the benefits too that not just low carbon but kind of positive impact itineraries can bring to local communities and economies. So one example is in Scotland, where we're working to support this innovative partnership between Visit Scotland and the Travel Corporation. They've both, as organisations, committed to achieve net zero emissions as soon as possible before 2050. And so they're together focusing from both the destination and the tour operator perspective, bringing each of their strengths, each of their abilities and influence to really help this process of not only accelerating decarbonisation of the supply chain, but also delivering itineraries and experiences that really have a positive impact locally. It's involving every element of the supply chain, so they're working with tour operators, DMCs, destination organisations, communities, individual tourism businesses and visitors. And the goal really is not only to achieve that in Scotland, but to really share those learnings globally and act as a lighthouse example for other destinations. But it's a really unique partnership, and those two perspectives together are so powerful because they're unlocking solutions to problems that individually they would struggle to do. My third milestone is unprecedented collaborations. I think the Visit Scotland TTC is an example of that, really. We need collaborations that break these traditional formats and really break down those silos that we were talking about earlier. So it means working cross-border, public and private pre-competitively, at different levels with organisations outside your vertical, outside of tourism, as we've heard this morning as well. Much existing climate action in our sector, while it's well-intentioned, is not at the speed or scale required to both decarbonise and adapt. So we really want to focus on collaborations that rethink those traditional borders and silos. So at the Travel Foundation, we're building partnerships with tech innovators, behaviour change specialists, capacity building experts, as well as tour operators and destinations and others for action at scale. So, for example, we're working with tour operators on ESG reporting to help support SMEs in the supply chain to make sure that those regulatory pressures are not just pushed down the supply chain, that they're able to respond well. In Honduras, one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to the effects of climate change, we've brought together a multi-stakeholder group right across public, private, environmental NGOs, ministries of tourism and environment, as well as the private sector, and they formed a group to together build collective climate action in tourism. And then in the Pacific Northwest, in the USA and Canada, we've begun exploring what collective climate action and innovation might look like if the bioregion represented by Washington, Oregon and British Columbia all worked towards a common agenda. So that massive area of 3 states, but collaborating on common challenges and building solutions together. So alongside Expedia Group, this is another example of collaboration and bringing people together to tackle these challenges together. We've developed an online climate champions training program for destinations. This will be available later this year. It will enable destinations to connect with peers, to gain fluency in climate resilience, create a climate action plan and become climate champions for their destination. We're working with cohorts of destinations. So, for example, there's one with the South Pacific Tourism Organisation we've been piloting this with, again, so that destinations can learn not just with, but from each other about climate action. So a very quick bonus milestone to encourage you to consider signing and implementing the Glasgow Declaration, which really helps support this kind of collaboration. It's such a community of people working in climate action and providing support and fostering collaboration and alignment. I'm moving on quickly, I'm very conscious of time. Milestone 4 is to bolster vulnerable destinations, to provide more effective support for the most vulnerable destinations in the shape of new international channels or frameworks that direct resources, especially financial resources, to where they're needed most. How can we ensure that destinations with less developed infrastructure or those remote places dependent on long-haul aviation and cruise are not left behind? I'll move on to the next slide, which is our climate justice report, which we released earlier this month with the University of Waterloo and other NGO partners to begin this overdue conversation on climate justice in tourism, about how we make emissions and decarbonisation, adaptation and resilience fairer across the board. How do we bolster destinations to help build targets and strategies and resources for building resilience? So enriching natural resources, not depleting them, providing nature-based solutions, etc., building the infrastructure needed for wider change and supporting destinations when they're impacted by climate-based disruption and crisis. So the report calls for the tourism sector really to integrate climate justice into its operations, and it concludes with 10 ideas that could rapidly be brought to life. So, for example, just highlighting 3 of those ideas here. One would be a new global climate fund to direct travel and tourism to support green transitions, resilience building and crisis response in vulnerable destinations. Another idea presented in the report is to establish pilot projects focused on key destinations and their critical climate-related issues, such as heat stress, water security, green energy transition, reducing dependency on at-risk tourism activities. And a final idea of the 10 would be mobilising the travel industry as a first responder in times of crisis, supporting humanitarian agencies and local leaders by repurposing hotels, kitchens, resources and logistical experience. It's something that the Blue Yonder in Kerala has been pioneering in this space, for example. And moving on to my final milestone is to reduce absolute emissions. This is the really crucial one and the most difficult, but the most necessary. It's a pivotal let's get real moment. We really need to ask ourselves, when will tourism-related emissions stop growing and start decreasing? Is it going to happen this decade? Our commitment must intensify. Sustainability and climate action should not be peripheral, but central to business strategy. It needs to be fully integrated, not just sitting on the side, but really fundamentally integrated into business strategy and mutually reinforcing all other business aims. The question arises of why most corporate spend still goes to promotion while sustainability investment and investment in climate action remains low. We really need to urgently redirect our focus to meaningful investments in those areas. The time for superficial measures is over. We need to move beyond actions that merely generate positive PR and critically assess growth. If record visitor numbers lead to higher emissions, how can we consider this acceptable in a warming world? Please call out this kind of growth as undesirable unless those emissions are managed and reduced. I'd also like to recognise those innovating and acting in this space and tackling the difficult questions around reducing emissions. We're fortunate at the Travel Foundation to see a lot of that. We work with lots of destinations and lots of industry partners, and we get the good news as well. We do see what others are doing in this space and the positive actions that are being taken. So just very quickly highlighting Vail, Colorado, where we worked on to support production of a stewardship roadmap, which is really realistic about the challenges, but also sets out key actions to work on decarbonising its tourism industry. In the Netherlands, the Road to Climate Neutral Tourism is a great example of a bold and holistic roadmap that looks at travel to and from the destination and a reduction of aviation, both of which make up the lion's share of emissions for the destination. So it sets out recommended actions for DMOs to focus marketing activities on domestic tourism and neighbouring countries, and only to apply far-away marketing on the basis of an eco-efficiency index, which again highlights that most valuable visitor per unit of CO2, and it also helps customers to understand the most sustainable way to travel. In terms of industry, just two operators to highlight who are really leading in this space. Intrepid have been leading in this space for a long time. They were the first tour operator to set science-based targets. And for example, they've been working on reducing flights from trips. So you can see this is the same trip, but with an internal flight removed in Vietnam, but also an additional stop added, which is great for that place that, you know, they'll get some extra income from tourism as well. The Travel Corporation is a family of over 40 travel brands and has established an industry-first carbon fund. So this is a bit like an internal tax on its businesses. It applies a price per guest based on the carbon footprint of each brand, and that's then used to create a central fund to decarbonise the business. So really encouraging innovation and change within the business itself. In the first year of operation last year, the fund invested over $1.8 million to 13 decarbonisation projects, such as energy audits for its suppliers, renewable energy infrastructure, sustainable fuel subsidies for its coaches. So it's really that internal investment, but ploughing back into decarbonising the business and making some radical changes. So in terms of that transformative leadership that Harold mentioned earlier, we really need that to be at C-suite and board level, not just the sustainability team who do brilliant jobs but are not always completely resourced. It needs to come from the top, that real support at C-suite and board level. We need political will, we need cross-sector commitment at all levels. We need increased capacity, not just training, but an environment, an enabling environment that fosters tough dialogue and addresses the risks to our industry's reputation and social licence to operate. We also need the right-sized solutions. And as you can see from this slide, that means change at scale. So it means changes to systems at the global and the local level. It needs to change really where we're looking at how we change the system in order to build in climate action right to the heart of the system. It means doing things differently, understanding and acting on our own sphere of influence alongside other stakeholders, and really designing unsustainable options right out of the system. But it also means behaviour change, again, at global and local level. Supporting and incentivising behaviour change, both by companies but also by tourists themselves. I'll just finish briefly with one example of that. We've recently created a strategic partnership with Behaviour Smart as part of the launch of their new Be Smart platform. I would really recommend checking it out. It was just launched a week or two ago. It's designed to support destination leaders, tour operators, travel agents, DMCs with really specific solutions to make a practical difference through behaviour change. So that might be sustainable travel options, it might be reducing food waste, it might be increasing visitor interaction with local businesses, and it's all about nudges and behaviour change incentives to help support those choices. It's a really great tool to support climate action planning as well. So this is my final slide between us and lunch. Let's not just envision, but make this future a reality. We don't say the decarbonisation scenario in our report is likely, it's only possible. We heard from Christine earlier about probabilities and possibilities, and this isn't a probability unless we make it a possibility. It is possible. Our research does show that it's possible, but it will take all we've got, and there's no time to waste. If you're feeling daunted, I know this can feel overwhelming, and remember that you're not alone in that, and our best chance is through collaboration and collective action. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. It's been really great to be part of this fascinating programme, and I'm really looking forward to meeting some of you later on and to continuing to be part of the discussion. Thank you.